Hi, Ray here. I'm glad you could join me. This video is all about the new NIKKOR lens for Z-mount cameras, the MC 105mm f2.8 VRS. I've had it for a month, from the day of its release actually, and I was tempted to rush out a quick first look video, maybe take the obligatory coin shot to catch the first wave of interest. But rather than compete with the avalanche of such videos, well, I couldn't beat the ones with access to pre-release copies anyway, so I decided to actually spend some time outdoors, brave the wilds of British Columbia, and give what I hope is an informed demonstration and my overall thoughts on the lens. Let's break down that model name, MC 105 2.8. The MC denotes it as a micro lens. VR means it has vibration reduction, and it's one of the Z-mount S series lenses. Now, I'm not really sure what the S stands for. Superb. Build quality. You can see it's not a compact lens, but it is surprisingly light for its size at 630 grams or 1.3 pounds. Maybe because, at least the lens barrel, is mostly plastic or some sort of composite, except for the throat and the mount itself, all metal. The lens hood is quite big. It's about 70 millimeters, and it has a lock, so it's not going anywhere until you release it. As a short telephoto prime, it has 105 millimeters fixed field of view, which has advantages for close-up work, and as far as I'm concerned, it's the preferred focal length for tight portraits. It has a maximum aperture of f2.8, and because it's designed for macro photography, it has a minimum aperture opening of f32 or more. I'll get to that in a minute. The focus group is driven by a stepping motor. It has a little LED or OLED panel on the top, and you press this little display button to scroll through a variety of data, including focus distance, f-stop, and magnification. So I've been using that latter one to know when I'm getting 1:1 magnification. It has 16 lens elements, including a spherical and ED glass. More on that later. There's a focus limiter switch, full and 0.5 to 0.25 meters, and an auto and manual switch there. There's a programmable ring here, which I've left to default to control the aperture. And to be honest, I don't use it that much. Once again, it comes with one of these baggies, no case. There's been a lot of chatter on social media that this lens couldn't be a portrait lens because its widest aperture is only 2.8. This criticism comes from a misunderstanding of depth of field and portrait technique. For the sake of this debate, let's define, to some degree, just what a portrait is. Well, it's a picture of a person, or perhaps a pet. And when I say pet, I mean larger animals, dogs, cats. But even if you keep domesticated small reptiles and insects, this is the lens for you as well. But portraits come in a wide range of framing, from headshot or bust to environmental portraits, the latter often shot with wide-angle lenses. The 105mm focal length is perfect for the former, tightly framed headshots, as I said. An 85 is an excellent in-between lens for slightly wider shots, and the 50mm focal length is ideal for 3/4 or full-length portraits. And when you're farther from and want to isolate the subject, absolutely. There's an argument to be made for wide apertures. Nikon has you covered there with the fantastic Z-mount 50mm f1.2s. It will soon be followed by a similar 85. And you want the ultimate in creamy bokeh and separation? How about the 58mm f.95 Noct lens? In my look at the 70 to 200 VR, I demonstrated the technical criteria and limits that come into play shooting portraits at close quarters. Okay, so if I'm using the 105 focusing at, say, 1.5 meters, I'll be setting the aperture to a minimum of f5.6 or more likely f8, because soft focus noses. Unless we're shooting profiles, then sure, open up the lens. But in most cases, human physiognomies, dogs more so, have topography, and getting hills and dales all acceptably in focus requires something more than f1.2 when focused at close distance. My preferred headshot distance with a 105 would be around 1.2 meters. Focusing on the eye will then get the nose acceptably sharp, and focus will fall off at the ear. It doesn't mean that should be your choice, but that's been my approach for 4 decades and more. And if your client, I guess, doesn't mind parts of the anatomy soft focused, don't let me prescribe your artistic approach. This lens, the manual focus 105mm 2.5, circa 1980, was my portrait lens for decades, until I knocked one of my gobos onto it when it was tripod mounted on a camera about 2 years ago. Now the aperture ring is pretty much impossible to move, doesn't focus that well, and it won't mount on a camera. Something's messed up here. So sad. And I think it would cost more to get it fixed than it's worth. So, old buddy, I keep it just for old time's sake. Before I killed it, it made hundreds and hundreds of portraits. It survived climbing, cycling, and ski mountaineering expeditions. In the studio, it stayed on the camera probably 80% of the time, and it launched many models, actors, and entertainers' careers. So I've been waiting to replace it with this Z mount S-Line Prime since it was announced on the lens roadmap. When it comes to f-stops, these micro lenses don't behave normally. We run into what's called effective f-number variation. What this means in practical terms is that when you focus at longer distances, you'll get your normal range from 2.8 to 32. As you focus closer, that range changes, smaller on the wide end and much smaller on the narrow side. So don't be surprised when you're focused at, say, 0.3 meters and your widest available aperture is f4.5. Or you're focused at the minimum focus, 0.29 meters, and suddenly you have access to a teensy-weensy f51. That's the nature of these beasts. And it makes sense, really, doesn't it? What's the chance you'll need 2.8 when you're focused so close? You're more likely to need the increased depth of field that comes with f32 or 45 or 51. But that doesn't mean that this lens can't be an excellent portrait lens. As I say, I love the rendering of the 105mm focal length. To the micro, let me begin by saying it is not my field of expertise. As I admitted in another video, I've never even owned a dedicated macro lens. My only experience with small worlds was several decades ago, using bellows extensions on a 4x5 view camera to photograph small product ads, jewelry, and watches, whatnot. So that's not no experience, but playing with this lens has admittedly revealed my rusty technique. Here's my initial impressions of this lens. First, I should mention that, as you may know, there's a companion 50mm version, and if money was no object, I might own both, the 50 for compactness and weight savings. But having to choose one, I prefer the 105. Gives you more room to maneuver around the subject, though that wasn't enough when it came to this wary creature, who, scarpered before I could get a second shot off. Nailed the eye though. I wonder, did Nikon include snake eye autofocus in the last Z6 firmware update? Rather than me rattling off all the specs, why don't I just drop a list here, and you can pause the video if you want to refer to the specifics. Now, why don't we get to a gallery of my humble tests? Photos made since I took possession of the lens in June. As I said, I'm no master of micro, so this lens is my teacher, and you can judge how good a student I am. We live in our macro world, for the most part, our attention held by big things. Meanwhile, there's this fascinating microscopic universe of proboscises, compound eyes, and horticultural sex. And yes, this is an excellent portrait lens. While we're on the subject, the 4-stop VR seems to do a decent job, but it's not really enough, at least for my less than steady hands, to counter camera shake at the closest distances. I mean, if you really want to get close, you're going to run into the exposure triangle limitations that have always come with close-up photography. Small apertures, slow shutter speeds, and if the camera's not stabilized, you'll end up with very high ISO demands. So, in order to nail composition and deal with those demands, a tripod, or at least a monopod, is still, I think, a good idea. And all this will depend on if the subject is moving around. Sticks will be pretty much compulsory if you're going to focus stack, as in this example. And the Z camera's inbuilt focus shift shooting is well executed. This doesn't make the focus stack. You'll need to perform the actual stack with software like Helicon or Photoshop, but it automatically creates the images, adjusting focus along the way. In the photo shooting menu, choose Focus Shift Shooting. Choose the number of shots. This will depend on the depth of field needed. Experiment. The camera will stop when infinity is reached. Focus step width. So the parameters here will depend on how close you focus. The closer you focus and the wider your aperture, the smaller your step size needs to be. For a real close-up, stick with a step size of 1. Even when you're shooting landscapes or longer distances, it's best to keep a step size of 5 or less. Interval. I leave this at the default of 0. If you're using flash and need to account for recycling or long exposures, then plan accordingly. First frame exposure lock. As it sounds, this locks exposure to the first frame in auto modes, so exposure doesn't vary that much. Peaking stack image. After the process is over, this produces a black and white sharpness preview of the combined stacked images. I haven't used this. Silent photography. Turn that on to maintain the meditative state induced by small world photography, and hit start when you're ready. Then, in Lightroom, you select the images and open them as layers in Photoshop. From there, select all layers and edit auto align layers. Make sure auto is selected. Then edit auto blend layers. Choose stack images. Unless you have a beast of a computer, these processes, they take quite a while. Have a beverage. It's worth the wait if everything works out. The MC105's focus, admittedly, is not blindingly fast, especially at nearer focus. I'm told this is par for the course when it comes to micro lenses. Nonetheless, it is prone to hunting, and when you're trying to focus on a busy bee, it can be somewhat frustrating. I suspect, just like other specialty subjects like bird photography, it's a matter of honing skills. Of course, there's this commodious, grippy, rubber-covered focusing ring that's hard to miss if you need to intervene. Despite ED, that extra low dispersion glass used in Nikon's telephoto lenses to correct for chromatic aberrations, there was a fair amount of color aberrations, particularly with reflective surfaces like the shot of my well-worn Tag watch. Before treatment with a Gaussian blur layer, color artifacts were quite noticeable. For video, it stands shoulder to shoulder with the rest of the S-line lenses as far as sharpness and rendering, which I think is unbeatable. It equals or surpasses the 85mm f1.8 in that regard. Relatively speaking, it's not the quietest of the bunch. I say relatively because these lenses are generally whisper quiet. But I have to say this seems the loudest amongst the 5 I own. 14-30 f4, 51.8, 85 1.8, and 70-200 2.8. So it's conceivable, if you're using an on-camera mic recording internally with long focus shifts, you might pick up a bit of the buzz. Since I've had the lens, I've used it for a few videos, time lapses, and my last talking head video. The autofocus is performed flawlessly using full-time focus with auto area. The tracking worked well, even in low light, so no complaints there at all. In fact, whether for video, stills, close-up photography, or portraiture, this lens has more than met my expectations, well worth the wait. And when it comes up to the close-up photography, I think I found a new hobby. I'm paying more attention to the micro worlds I once passed by. So from that perspective, it's a real bargain. Well, that's my look at the MC 105mm f2.8 VRS lens. It gets 5 stars from me, and I'll be using it a lot. Until the next time, take care of yourselves. Cheers. We'll see you later.